Well, David Wallace-Wells, welcome back to the Climate Pod.
Really good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, when we first spoke with you in 2021, you talked about how distressing it was that the impacts of global warming were already worse than many had predicted. More people had suffered than expected, and adaptation measures were woefully inadequate. 2023 hasn't been any better, maybe even worse in terms of climate worsened extreme weather. What have you made of what's happened thus far in 2023?
Well, I think there are basically two really big stories going on at once, and it's a little bit hard to follow them at the same time since they seem to be running in opposite directions. And this is probably similar to the way the world looked to us in 2021, but it's gotten only more intense over time, which is to say, we have a green transition. It's actually underway. It's moving a lot faster than almost anyone believed was possible just a few years ago. There is, in that sense, quite a lot of hope. And our expectations for warming this century have come down quite a bit since 5 years ago, certainly 10 years ago. We're now expecting probably something on the order of 2 to 3 degrees Celsius as opposed to 4 or 5 degrees Celsius. And that really is a major step forward. At the same time, we keep being surprised by the intensity of impacts that we're seeing, even at the temperature levels that we have to the global average temperature levels that we have today, 1.2, 1.3 degrees. And most scientists surveying the literature say that that's true, not just of what we're observing in the real world, but the way that the modeling is evolving as well, that almost every impact you look at, impacts that you might have once predicted to be at arriving only at 4 degrees are now expected at 2.5 degrees, or impacts that were only expected at 5 degrees now seem possible at 3 degrees. And that means that while we have really built up a huge amount of momentum and given ourselves at the level of global average temperature quite a lot of reason for hope and optimism, the climate system itself is responding much more quickly than we feared. And as a result, we may end up even at a much lower average temperature level in something like the same ravaged place as we expected when we were projecting a future for 4 or 5 degrees. And what's distressing about this is not just that it undermines the progress that we've made to this point, it's how much uncertainty it reminds us we are living through. We look at these models, we look at the IPCC reports, we look at papers in Nature and Science, we hear interviews with incredibly pedigreed scientists who spent their entire lives studying this impact or that impact. And we want to believe that they, at the very least, have a good sense of where the future is heading and can tell us with some degree that allows us to plan, precisely how much drought to expect, precisely how much of an impact on food production to expect, precisely what kind of heat extremes to expect. And even if those seem really grim, at least if we know, we can adapt and respond. But the climate experience of the last couple of years, I think, shows us that we know a lot less about those things than we want to believe. And that's really quite scary. Living through uncertainty is, in a lot of ways, worse than living through known apocalypse. And that's sort of where we are. There are some reasons for optimism, some reasons for hope, but we're also stepping out into uncharted territory. And we're constantly being surprised, mostly by how bad things are getting so quickly, but also just by surprises. And unfortunately, I think that's going to be the basic dynamic at play for the foreseeable future. Things are going to keep getting warmer for a while, at least, probably for many decades. And the impacts of that are going to be not just bad, they're also going to be surprising. And I don't think we yet have a way of responding to that uncertainty in our politics or our culture, which means it can feel a bit disorienting even to people like you and me who follow the science quite closely.
Yeah, I think one of those surprises, or maybe something that just caught meteorologists off guard this year, was the impact of the smoke from the Canadian wildfires here in America, right, in the Northeast. You noted in a recent column that fire historian Stephen Pine calls the era that we're living in now the Pyrocene. What surprised you the most about this year's wildfires in Canada?
Well, I would pull back even a little bit further just to orient us in our cultural understanding of wildfire more generally, which is to say Americans, even 5 years ago, even in fire-prone places like California, were really primarily worried about the destruction of their homes and communities human loss of life, but also houses being burned. And in the case of, a town like Paradise, whole towns being destroyed. This is really the paramount, preeminent anxiety as related to fire that anyone in America had. And if you lived somewhere that wasn't fire prone, you might think, oh man, those Californians are crazy. Why would you live in the wildland urban interface in California when you know that fires might come for your house at any time of night? You have to keep a go bag by the door. You have to evacuate at a moment's notice. This seems like no way to live. This seems to a New Yorker, at least, like no way to live. And really, it was only, I think, in 2020 when we had those really dramatic fire days in the Bay Area when the sun didn't rise and the whole sky went orange, that most Americans really started paying attention to the effect of fire through air quality. And it's also the case that the science there is growing. This is a relatively young science. We know about air pollution. We know that 10 million people a year are dying globally from air pollution, which is a horrific number. But we know less about the effect of wildfire smoke and exactly how it differs from other kinds of air pollution. We know less about how it's dispersed over the country. It used to be the case that if you were looking, even in 2020, if you were looking at the fires in California and thinking, wow, that air seems horrible, you probably thought the problem of air quality from fire was concentrated right where the fire was. But 87% of the smoke impacts of fire travel outside the county in which the fire is burning, and 60% outside the state. And in some of these recent years, we've had more health impacts in the eastern US than the western US, even though the fires are burning in the western US. And that has to do with population density as well as the way that the smoke is traveling, but it does show that the impacts are not containable or quarantinable wherever the fires are. So we were sort of starting to learn that a little bit over the last couple of years, but the average person, I think, still thought of wildfire smoke as a public health threat that was concentrated where the fires themselves were burning. And the Canada fires this year really turned that on its head. Now, these fires themselves, even by the old metrics, just about area burned, are quite horrifying, putting aside the smoke and emissions impacts. The area burned, we're talking about multiples of what the previous recent worst fires in Canadian history have been. I think it's now 3 times as large as the worst American fire season since 1970. So the worst season that the US has had as a country, which is a huge country, in 50 years, Canada has had like 3 times as much land burn this year already, and we still have months to go in fire season. So we might see maybe even twice as much area burned as we've seen to this point going forward. The production of smoke has been, a real eye-opener especially for cities in the Midwest and the East Coast, which have really never seen this before. And in New York, where I live, there were some really harrowing days. I think a lot of New Yorkers feel like this is the summer when climate impacts really hit home, even more than Hurricane Sandy, even more than Hurricane Irma. It was these smoke events a couple of months ago that really taught us that we were vulnerable, because the lesson there is like, you can do whatever you're going to do. You can live in your concrete high rise. You can have your air, but when you look outside and the sky is orange with smoke, and you can feel the burning embers every time you breathe outside, even if you're wearing a mask, it's just a different kind of a lesson being taught. And then we have, new data the last couple of weeks. Different methodologies show different measures, but new data showing that these fires may have produced 2.5 or 3 times as much carbon as all of Canada produced last year. So you take all of their industrial activity, all of their transportation, all of their cars, all their factories, all their infrastructure, all their agriculture, all their land use changes, all of that last year as an entire country, and these fires may have produced multiples of that so far this year already. So the lessons there, I think, are that these impacts are not local. They have cascading impacts. They travel around the world. They also shake out through populations. These smoke plumes have traveled all the way to Europe. And I think that's one big lesson. Another big lesson is just about the size and scale of the impacts, which is to say they are, basically an unpredicted level of burning. In fact, a lot of the wildfire modeling doesn't suggest anything like this kind of area growth in Canada, even over the next few decades. So we're kind of off the charts there too, which is another reminder of how scary our uncertainty around these impacts is. And then the third thing is that we can't do anything about them. And I think this is really quite grim. I think that, even those of us who are most alarmed about climate change have in the back of our minds the idea that, like, well, if the world really woke up, if the world really focused on the project of decarbonization on the one hand, but also the project of adaptation on the other, we have the resources we need to protect ourselves and secure our livelihoods for the future. So, like, building these massive flood barriers is going to be really complicated and expensive, but if we chose to do it, we could actually protect the cities where those floods were predicted. And the fires are a different kind of a challenge. It is simply not possible to put out these fires. They are too large. There are too many of them. They're burning through mostly uninhabited land in the north of Canada. Good, smart forest management and fire policy has taught us over the last generation that we shouldn't put them out because forests need to regenerate through fire. So we don't even really want to, but even if we wanted to, we didn't have the resources or the strategy or the technical know-how to do it. And we don't have the capacity to meaningfully reduce the risk of these kinds of fires because the amount of fuel, that's what fire scientists call forest, the amount of fuel that's available in these fire-prone parts of the world is growing really dramatically. And we can do things on the margins to limit those burn areas. But when you have a season like you're seeing this year, on some level, we're just going to have to be living with it. Like, adaptation is accommodation in this instance. It's not a new form of control. So I think those are the three big lessons from the Canadian fires, and they're quite scary. They're quite distressing. There isn't really like a happy note to pull out of it.
Well, you touched on this a little bit, but forests are typically carbon sinks. But with the increase in these extreme wildfires over the last decade, how much of the recent emission reduction efforts, as little as they have been by humans, how much of that has been offset by the carbon emissions from these fires?
Well, I think, at a global level, carbon emissions from wildfires are not enormous. In a really bad year, they can be, I don't know exactly what the data is off the top of my head, something like 20% of global emissions. That's in a really bad year. In lighter years, smaller. But at a national level, it can be quite significant. In California in 2020, that was their record-setting year in California. They haven't had a worse year since, and they never had a year like that before. I think 6 of the 7 largest fires in modern California history burned in that one year. Actually, sorry, that's not true. It's 4 of the top 7, and then the other 2 were in 2021. But in that year, more carbon was produced from the burning of California fire than had been saved in the previous 16 years of emissions reductions. So everything that California, which we think of as a green leader, everything that they had done in terms of fuel efficiency standards, in terms of, they have a carbon tax there, in terms of all those measures, in terms of their renewable rollout, all of that was over 16 years smaller than the negative impact of the fires of that season. And I mentioned earlier that in Canada this year, we're talking about the possibility that, and likelihood that the fires will produce more carbon than the entire Canadian economy has produced. And that means that, like, it's not just that it's undoing a little bit of emissions reductions. It means even if we got all the way to zero, even if Canada had gotten all the way to zero and was a net zero country right now in 2023, these fires would have more than undone all of that progress. So when we're talking about countries that have reduced their emissions by, 20%, 18%, depending on the country, there's a much larger margin for error, and the fires are wiping them out. And this is not the first country in the world in which this has happened. In Australia, the crazy Black Summer fires of 2019, 2020 had this effect too, that there were more carbon emissions from the fires than from all of Australia. It's possible that there have been some years in which the Siberian fires did the same in Russia, although the method of, the tracking is a little less good there. So, it's not the case yet that at the global level, wildfire emissions are like a dominant source of carbon, but it's especially concerning because of what we were talking about earlier, that we don't really have the tools to control them. So all these other things, in theory, if we really wanted to get to net zero in 10 or 12 years, we could rush through that and get at least pretty close in most of the rich countries in the world. We're not doing it at that pace, but in theory we could. But even in theory, we don't have a way to stop the fires and the carbon that they're producing. And that's really concerning, not just for hitting our targets over the next couple of decades, it's concerning in the long run, because when we're talking about our projections for the end of the century and our understanding that the planet's temperature is going to stop rising when we get to net zero, if we have any marginal emissions from fires, those could mean that we won't stop warming. And the difference between keeping carbon concentrations where they are and actually allowing the natural sinks of the planet to bring us additionally back down so that we're no longer at wherever we end up when we get to net zero, 450, 480, 500, back down to hopefully to 350 or below. The difference between keeping the carbon concentration stable and sort of keeping the planet warming at a constant level and allowing the planet to cool down by reducing its own carbon emissions naturally, that's only a couple of gigatons a year. So the risk that wildfires could be producing that additional marginal carbon is really quite high. I think it's, in fact, I would say, given what we know now, it seems quite likely that at the end of the century, even if we totally eliminate all anthropogenic emissions entirely, we're going to be dealing with a buffer of wildfire emissions that may prevent the planet from drawing down carbon in any natural way, which means that unless we have large-scale human negative emissions, carbon concentrations will be stable, the planet will continue to warm, and we could end up in a quite scary situation where we've done all we can, and yet the problem is still getting worse.
Yeah, when I read your most recent column, the one thing that stuck out to me is what you've mentioned a couple of times already, is the fact that we have this kind of false belief that we can control certain aspects of nature, and that's kind of built into our climate plans. And this year is proving, time and time again, that that's not the case, whether it's with the wildfires or what's happening with the oceans. I mean, we're seeing off the chart ocean temperatures this year, that's leading some to worry that we've reached this tipping point. We now know that several factors, such as the stronger El Nino, weaker trade winds, even an underwater volcano, have all added to the underlying effects of a warming planet. But that's really of no comfort, because humans just can't impact, they have no control over any of those natural occurrences. I mean, how concerned are you about what's happening in the oceans this year?
Well, before I get to that, let me just say briefly, it's almost more striking to me to think about, for instance, the heat extremes in a place like Phoenix, where that is like truly, it's a man-made city. We think this is a place where everything is controllable. We're not talking about just uninhabited forests. We're not talking about the depths of the ocean. We're talking about a city of several million people, modern city built over the last couple of decades. And in theory, we should be able to respond to those threats by changing the environment in a way that allows human life to flourish there. And I think to some degree we are. I think that, deaths in Phoenix from heat would be much higher, if we hadn't taken some public health measures over the last couple of decades. But it's also clear that we're not doing nearly enough, even in a place that would be like a kind of a laboratory case study for where we should expect adaptation to reign. We're doing something, we're making a difference, we're making, improving the risks on the margins, but we're not making it so that living in Phoenix when it's 120 degrees is as comfortable as living in Phoenix used to be when it was 95 degrees. We just haven't gotten there yet. So that's even, in the kind of a place where you would expect us to be able to do the most. And the oceans, as you say, even more than the world's forests, are just, we literally don't know what's down there. It's a cliche that scientists often say, we understand outer space more than we understand our own oceans, but it's basically true. There are a lot of systems and dynamics which scientists have described to some extent, but don't feel entirely confident in their understanding of them. And then when those systems interact with climate impacts, very much don't understand where we are or where we're headed. And that means that's one reason why ocean scientists are really especially worried this summer, as we're seeing all of these totally off the charts sea surface temperatures, but also more localized marine heat waves. I think the latest figure I saw said that 40% of the world's oceans were experiencing heat waves, which is 4 times what's normal. The Antarctic sea ice is so off the charts low that anytime you try to characterize it statistically and call it like a 5 standard deviation or a 6 standard deviation event, it's like, it doesn't even make sense to do that anymore, because, you know, obviously the comparison is broken. If what you're saying is that we shouldn't be seeing this except once in every 7 billion years, the planet's not 7 billion years old. So, you know, we don't even have the tools with which to describe how unusual what's being seen in the oceans is. And the thing that I keep coming back to again and again when thinking about it is that, you know, we know that 90% of the excess heat from global warming is taken up by the oceans. And what that means, that stat gets cited a lot by people talking about climate, but we don't take the next step to say what that means is that the oceans are being hit 9 times as hard as we are on land. So if we think we're seeing the beginnings of really scary climate change where we live on land, they're seeing 9 times as much impact there, and have been now for decades. Now, exactly how that plays out in terms of the effects on the ocean's circulation patterns, on marine life, on, you know, the health of phytoplankton, on the health of kelp forests, all of that's up in the air. We do seem to know pretty confidently that the world's coral reefs are really imperiled by this heat, and probably in a world of 1.5 degrees, you know, the corals won't be able to recover fast enough to survive from each of these major bleaching events. All of these other impacts are, you know, again, I think worried about in uncertain terms. But in general, when it comes to climate, we've for far too long taken uncertainty as a source of comfort and say, well, we don't know that things are going to get that bad, and therefore we kind of act, or at least believe, or in our heart of hearts, that it won't get that bad. But the events of this summer, and particularly maybe the events of the ocean, teach us that uncertainty really should be counseling us in the other direction, because we're going to be surprised on the high end quite a lot. And rather than assuming that we're always going to end up on the low end of our projections, it seems the opposite is more likely to be true. And when we're talking about a system as big as the ocean, as complicated as the ocean, some of these potential tipping points are really, really quite scary and ominous. And, you know, this paper got published last week about the possibility of the collapse of the AMOC in the North Atlantic. You know, there are a lot of questions about it. A lot of scientists don't want to take its findings to the bank. But it is a serious group of people modeling mathematically the trends in this ocean circulation pattern and saying there's a pretty good chance that this system is going to collapse in the next couple of decades. And whether it's 3 decades or 4 decades or 7 decades, as recently as the last IPCC report, they were arguing about whether to even include it as a possibility this century. So, you know, some of the headlines said it could happen as soon as 2035 or 2025, I don't even remember, right around the bend. And a lot of scientists are like, we really don't think that's going to happen. But, you know, if we're saying we need to worry about it as a risk in 2050 or 2060, as opposed to 2150 or 2160, that's a huge revision to our understanding of the near-term climate future of the planet. That's a world that I'll likely be living in. My children will certainly be living in. It's pretty much right around the corner. And again, that's happening with impact after impact, where we're saying these things that we used to think of as pretty remote possibilities now seem quite concerning. The AMOC was one of these tipping points, you know, really closely examined by the sort of tipping point scholars in their major review of 6 months or so ago. And in almost every case, they were revising the thresholds for where the tipping points would tip from where it had been a few years before when they published their previous set of work. So it's a scary time to be alive. What can I say?
Huh. Well, The Guardian got a lot of pushback for that from scientists, as you mentioned, because they did, you know, the headline was the Gulf Stream could collapse as early as 2025. And scientists said, yeah, that's not exactly what the study said, but the study did have that range of like 2025 to 2095. As a journalist, how hard is it, or how should you communicate such uncertainty, right, in the science to the general public?
I think it's a really tricky question. I mean, I'm in a position where, you know, I'm technically my job at the Times is I'm an opinion columnist. I can write in a more direct first person way. I can write a little bit more essayistically. The things that I can do in talking just about uncertainty as a principle are a little bit different than what's available to a news reporter who's writing in a much more circumscribed way about what a particular paper says. And the truth is, this paper does say that it is possible that this circulation system could collapse by 2025. It does say that. It's not saying that that's its median projection, but it says that it's possible. In general, when you're writing those kinds of stories, I think you can solicit criticism and feedback from other scientists who have somewhat different views. And I actually think The Guardian did that in their piece. I think primarily the concern was about the headline. And, I have mixed feelings about this. I've felt, maybe even especially over the course of this summer, that there's been a lot of scientific criticism of alarm and panic. We've been through this cycle before. I've been through this cycle before. But when folks on social media started worrying about the anomalous sea surface temperatures and the anomalous Antarctic sea ice, the North Atlantic heat wave, in May and June, there were a lot of really pedigreed scientists who were saying, like, we shouldn't freak out. This is merely on the high end of what we would expect given the amount of global temperature rise that we've seen. And that may well be true. I defer to their expertise about all of that. But if we are seeing evidence that we are tracking on the high end of expected events at the level of warming we are today, that is concerning. The story of climate change that we're on, the curve that we're on, is scary. And I think it's perfectly legitimate and reasonable for not just lay people, but scientists too, to express concern about that and even alarm. And if somebody who's, even if it's not their expertise, someone who knows a little bit about the systems of the oceans sees, sea surface temperatures in a particular area, 4, 5, 6 degrees above record levels, and their response to that is to go, holy shit, this is scary. That's a perfectly legitimate response to have. Now, it's not necessarily the response that you'd want, the headline of the New York Times or the headline of the Guardian to express. But in an article in which you're surveying scientists' feelings about the state of the ocean and where we're heading, I think it's perfectly fine to have some people in there, in fact, healthy, and to have some experts in there quoted expressing panic and uncertainty. And in fact, I think over the course of the summer, you've seen more and more of that. So in the late spring, early summer, there were a few people who were really worried, and then a lot of people saying, let's not panic just yet. And over the course of the summer, as these anomalies have not just continued, but grown, we've seen a kind of growing chorus of experts saying, this is really beyond what we expected or even predicted. And we don't yet know how to understand it or make sense of it. It may just be a freak season. It may have to do with, the El Nino and the particular, a new supercharged dynamic that we haven't seen before with El Nino. Presumably, we'll be able to piece together an explanation over the course of the next few years. But again, even if you piece together an explanation, that doesn't mean that it's okay. It's like a world that's been thrown into disarray by 1.2, 1.3 degrees of warming is still a quite concerning world, even if you can say, 60% of the anomaly is attributable to baseline global average temperature change, and 15% to El Nino, and 10% to these Saharan dust effects, and this amount for the water vapor. Even if you can break it down, that's valuable. We want to know more about the system that we're living in, but it doesn't mean that what we're seeing is not concerning and striking. And I do think one of the jobs of climate journalism is to communicate that, especially if many people who know the material best are a little bewildered. And the way I read the science, and the way that I've, the conversations I've had with scientists and the comments I've read of theirs in other people's work, suggests to me that there's at least a significant minority of ocean scientists who are really freaking out. And, I've been down this road before and been criticized for it, but if there is a significant minority of scientists who are freaking out about something, I think one job of an honest journalistic apparatus is to communicate that to the public.
Yeah, it's super concerning. And you touched on Phoenix earlier and just how uncomfortable it is to live there. And what is it's a fast growing American city. I mean, this heat wave and so much of what what we've seen in 2023 in the last few years is that basically, no one really is safe from these, the impacts of global warming. Rich people, they've done everything they can to avoid this as much as possible. but it's just, it's changing lives. It's changing the reality in a way that there really is no kind of going back to the comforts we once knew, whether it's, the fires in these popular tourist areas, just smoke, basically canceling so many of your, outdoor plans in the summertime. And of course, these are rich people problems. So we're not asking for sympathy, but do you think people are realizing just how much of what was once enjoyed is now being, basically sacrificed because the planet is just not what it used to be?
Yeah, I mean, one of the most striking, it's sort of something I've observed in commentary rather than in the world of climate. But one of the most striking things I've seen over the last couple of days is a column by Neil Ferguson, who's a conservative British historian in Bloomberg, whose last book was literally about the politics of catastrophism, and it was like a screed against the risks of catastrophism. Global warming being one of the things, but not the only thing that he was writing about in that book. I think it was called The Politics of Doom. And he wrote a column in Bloomberg in which he was saying, basically, forget summer. We're not going to be taking summer vacations anymore. We're certainly not going to be taking them to the places we've been used to taking them over the course of the 20th century. And we may even come to regard this season as a kind of forbidding, scary time, as opposed to a time for delight and pleasure, because many of the places where we developed that idea about what summer was are no longer pleasurable in the summer. And he was speaking, I think, primarily about the Mediterranean. Now, others have pointed out, it's a bit of a blinkered view. There are plenty of other places you can go on vacation in the summer if you have the luxury of going on vacation. And there are plenty of places where people vacation in the summer already that are a lot hotter than the Mediterranean is right now. But I actually think that Europe is an interesting case study in the broader dynamic you raise, because we have had this narrative for a time. I think it's important to keep at the front of our minds that, the poor world is more vulnerable for a number of reasons. The rich world is more protected, even if not perfectly protected against the impacts of climate change. But I also think that narrative, while morally important to keep at the front of our minds, is imperfect and inadequate. And I think that heat in Europe is showing us that maybe most dramatically. So, last spring into the early summer, there was this unbelievable, unprecedented heat wave through South Asia, India and Pakistan in particular, where you had literally hundreds of millions of people living for days, or in some cases even weeks, quite close to what had been under temperatures that had quite close to what had been described as the maximum survivable limit for humans. And in fact, there were a couple of cities that reached that level, for only a couple of hours, but still reached this level, which had been described by scientists as a combination of heat and humidity, such that even young, healthy people outside for a period of time, exerting themselves only lightly, say walking, would die. And we didn't see that mass death in South Asia. Now, almost certainly our understanding of the mortality impacts of that heat wave are inadequate. There are probably many, 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 many more heat deaths last summer in those countries than the official statistics suggest. But even so, we're not talking about the equivalent of the opening of Ministry for the Future, the Kim Stanley Robinson novel, where you have millions of people dying over the course of a couple of days. If that had happened, we would have seen it very clearly. And yet in Europe, we saw temperatures that were much lower, 20, 25 degrees lower, killing, according to one recent study, 61,000 people. And that's, I think, because we've treated some of these limits as universal, when in fact they reflect cultural differences, they reflect physiological differences, they even reflect, over the course of an individual's experience of an individual season, how comfortable you are in the heat. So historically, sooner in the summer the heat wave comes, the deadlier it is, because by the end of the summer, almost everybody's kind of gotten used to the heat. And that's true at a lifelong level too. So if you're living in a place like India, where you're used to seeing summer temperatures over 100, getting for a few weeks to 110 may be uncomfortable, may be hard, and maybe even will kill some people. But at the population scale, it's not going to be nearly as devastating as getting to temperatures 100, 105 in Europe. And this is really interesting for a number of reasons. I mean, it gives the lie to some of the some of the morally ugly but emotionally reassuring stories we've told ourselves in the global north, that it's going to be the poorer, browner people in the world who suffer most. And I don't know exactly what it tells us about adaptation and response, because while it's certainly the case that Europe is not perfectly air conditioned, there are many more Europeans who have air conditioning than people in India do. And we can do more to build out more air conditioning in Europe, although there's a carbon cost to that. We can do that in theory. But, in general, we've talked about adaptation, this sort of catch-up adaptation measures like AC as being a tool available to the poorer parts of the world. And it apparently isn't protecting even the richest parts of the world all that effectively. Now, that's not to say that there's no impact. As I said earlier, like if there's no air conditioning in Phoenix, we would have seen tens of thousands of deaths there this summer just in that one city. But we're not to a place where we've made it comfortable to live in the new climate we're living in today. And we know it's going to get hotter. We know it's going to get messier. We know it's going to get messier, not just in the global south, but I think increasingly have an appreciation that it's going to get messier in the global north too. And, the Canadian wildfire and the smoke effects of that is just another reminder, in addition to the heat waves.
Yeah, I want to switch gears here to progress, because when you first started talking to me today, you talked about obviously things are getting worse with the planet. The impacts of global warming are starting to pop up more and more, but we are making some progress on the on the legislative level. How impactful do you think the Inflation Reduction Act will be in helping to mitigate some of the worst impacts of global warming?
Well, I guess there are a few different levels to that question. One is like, what is the role of the U.S. in general? Like, if U.S. emissions go to zero, what's the effect on global average temperature and climate change? Then there's the question of what the bill is doing, and even that question is really there's a huge range of potential impacts based on how quickly we can build out the things that have been funded in that bill or theoretically funded in that bill. And I think we haven't yet sorted that out. I mean, some of the most trusted estimates suggest that as much as 80% of the potential gains from the IRA could be lost if we don't much more rapidly build out electricity transmission and solve some permitting issues that have prevented the rapid rollout of renewables and interconnection with the grid. So I think the short answer is it's very much an open question. But I do think that, in general, in part because of the IRA, but also because of changes and transformations that are larger than the IRA, I think that we are moving very much in the right direction in the US and maybe even more dramatically and significantly around the world. We've been growing our renewable capacity quite significantly globally over the last few years. And we haven't yet meaningfully cut into our fossil fuel use. We're basically just using our new renewable capacity to add to our power capacity. But most sober-minded analysts think that that's going to happen sometime over the course of the next 5 years, is that we will actually begin to peak and decline. And I don't want to get too self-congratulatory about that because, I've said this before, but all it means to reach a peak is that you're not doing more damage than you did every single other year before. When you're growing when the curve is going up and when you're at the peak, that means every single year on that peak you've done worse and done more damage than every single year before. And when you start to come down, all it means is that you're doing not quite as bad as the worst year in human history. Maybe you're doing only as bad as the 5th worst year in human history, but you're still doing quite a lot of damage. And until you get much farther down the curve, and indeed all the way to zero, you're still doing some amount of damage. Nevertheless, it was hard to imagine that a decade or two ago. And the revolution in renewable pricing in particular has really changed the game there. It's now the case that, depending on the study, perhaps as much as 95% of the world's population now lives in places where solar is cheaper than dirty energy. There are still significant financing problems in much of the world, because borrowing in the global south is much harder than borrowing in the global north. There are also, issues of incumbency. The fossil fuel business is not giving up easy. But the trends are all pointing in the right direction in a quite encouraging way. And I think the same is true in the U.S. I think most climate people don't appreciate that. We're trying to cut our emissions in half by 2035, and according to Biden, 2030 according to the IPCC, but 2035 according to Biden. That's off of a 2005 peak, in which we've already cut like 24%, or something more than that even. And there's a little bit of accounting chicanery there, like we're counting off of a 2005 peak. Most of the rest of the world is counting off of 1990 when emissions were lower. But even so, we're moving in the right direction even before the IRA. We're not moving fast enough, but we were moving in the right direction. And the question is, how much can this legislation and this funding accelerate that? And, as I said, I think that's a bit of an open question. We need to get over some hurdles to build out quite quickly in an ideal world. But I do think it's also important to appreciate just how large an investment this really was, for all of its compromises and uncomfortable as they may be. You're talking about by far the biggest spend in American history on climate, and it may be considerably larger when all is said and done than the CBO told us it was. So the bill was passed as a $369 billion bill, I think, and that was important for a number of reasons, but in part because for budgetary reasons and also for political reasons, they wanted to offset all that cost with tax hikes. But most modeling says that actually there's going to be considerably more spend than that, maybe twice as much, maybe even 3 times as much. So we could be talking about a bill that ultimately produces over $1 trillion in climate spending, and that's not even counting the loan office that was sort of supercharged at the Department of Energy, which is it's hard to know exactly how to count that because the outlay is actually not that significant. It's because you get repaid, but ultimately we're talking about producing a huge investment wave in clean energy, and we're seeing that play out already. There's genuinely a manufacturing boom in the U.S. It's genuinely powered mostly by clean energy production, and that's just a year since the bill was passed. With everybody complaining that the regulations aren't in place and the permitting isn't in place, we're still seeing a manufacturing boom. So I think it's certainly the case that the bill has been helpful and it's added to the momentum. Whether it achieves its full potential, I think, is an open question and a complicated one to answer and solve at the moment. But in the big picture, I may have said this to you when we last spoke, but it feels to me that we're now in a situation where if we had twice as much time, it would look really good. If we had to 2100 to get to net zero instead of 2050, I'd be really confident. Unfortunately, that's not the world we're living in. But it's a reminder that, things are finally moving in the right direction, and by historical standards, quite quickly.
Yeah, they're moving in the right direction now. And you're right, it's not fast enough. We're not doing enough to mitigate everything, but we're at least moving in the right direction. That all could change. I mean, it is theoretically possible that could change. Last week, Darna Noor wrote an article in The Guardian about the Heritage Foundation's plan to roll back all of the climate legislation if a new president and a more Republican favored Congress is elected in 2024. I mean, I know you've written about Texas's failed attempts to do similar things in Texas. I mean, what do you make of this attempt at rolling back national progress by Republican leaders?
In general, I am not too worried about it. I'm probably less worried about it than some of my friends in the climate world are. And that's because I do think that there's just been an incredible payout from the IRA, but also from renewable energy across red America. It is a meaningful part of the employment system, of the economic infrastructure of those places. And they're just getting handed cash from the federal government for it. And, you can mount a culture war fight even in that context. You did see a lot of Republican states, for instance, refusing Medicaid expansion over the last decade, when that was essentially free money from the federal government. It can happen. But I personally take heart in the way that the IRA was politicized, which is to say, almost not at all in the midterm elections last fall. When Obamacare passed, it was like the dominant political story for several years. It dominated not just the 2010 midterms, but it was a huge part of the 2012 election. It even was a factor in the 2014 election, and it was a part of what Donald Trump campaigned on in 2016. That fight lasted for a long time because the legislation really, really bothered many conservative Americans, at least as they understood it, and powered a lot of culture war fights over it for a decade, even if they didn't end up undoing it, because in the end it would have been damn self-defeating to do. They still got a huge amount of political mileage out of it. The IRA has been really, really different. You have this memo prepared by the Heritage Foundation. It probably will inform some policy planning in a Donald Trump presidency or a Ron DeSantis presidency or whoever. I mean, I think that will be a part of how they think about the energy policy of the country. But when you look at the state level and the local level, you look at congressional elections last fall, Republicans just weren't interested in talking about the IRA at all. It was like a non-issue. It wasn't a positive issue. It wasn't like, Brian Kemp has actually been claiming a lot of credit in Georgia for the money he's attracted to Georgia. But in general, it's not the case that Republicans are cheering the IRA, but they're not shouting it down either. And I think that that's a little bit of a sign of which way the winds are blowing here. And as you say, I think in Texas, the little sort of parable that unfolded there this year is illuminating, which is to say, like, the fossil fuel industry realized that in the new economic landscape, they were going to be the losers. The IRA, market forces outside the IRA had meant that the energy future of Texas lay with renewables, not fossil fuels. And they wanted to fight that. They wanted to secure their traditional position as the dominant energy supplier, and indeed dominant culturally and economically too. And they took action in the state legislature to do that, to kneecap the rollout of renewables. And that's on some level remarkable on its own. It used to be the case that it was climate advocates who were fighting the market and fossil fuel interests who were saying, no, the market should rule, the market should rule. And now it's the fossil fuel companies who are fighting the market and the green energy companies who are saying, let the market do its work, let the market do its work. But even then, we saw another shift where a huge group of conservative Republicans in Texas, culturally, the most fossil fuel drenched state in the country, looked at the numbers and said, no, our people are going to be paying higher bills, and we're going to be more at risk of blackouts if we don't allow renewables to continue growing. So we're not going to go for this. We're not going to kneecap this industry. We're going to let the growth continue. They scored some small victories again, but in the big picture, they basically lost. And I think that's going to be the blueprint for how these things unfold going forward. There are going to be some fights, like there are also about ESG regulations among, brought by Republicans, attorneys general and stuff. But in the big picture, money talks really loudly. And I think there, the direction of change is really quite clear. And it's good, it's good for us, but it's also good for Texans, that they have not had to deal with blackouts this year. And in part, that's because of the extra capacity that's been provided by renewables. A couple of years ago, when they had a freak winter storm and they lost power and lots of people died, lots of people suffered. And they haven't had to do that since, in part because every solar panel that gets put up and every wind turbine that gets erected is just adding to their capacity and making them a more energy resilient state. I think Texans are, not maybe, to an individual, but at the state level, understand that. And their politics is evolving to reflect that too, which is, again, it's not happening fast enough for you or me, but it's quite remarkable given where Texas energy politics were just a decade ago. When Barack Obama went to Texas and gave a speech asking to be applauded for making the U.S. the world's largest producer of oil and gas. That was what Barack Obama thought he had to say in Texas, right? Because of the politics of Texas. I think a decade from now, a Democratic president is not going to be kissing the ring of Texas oil and gas. They're going to be kissing the ring of Texas wind and solar.
Just to wrap up here, as you look ahead, what concerns you the most about the climate crisis that you think that most people aren't currently thinking about?
Well, I think it's the same old story that, you know, we get alarmed in thinking of these impacts as the new normal, when in fact what we're seeing is the end of everything we've ever known as normal, and the beginning of a period of quite significant change in which things that shock us in 2023 are going to be pretty normal in 2033, and even comfortable by comparison in 2043. Now, not every impact is going to move that quickly, but in general, we have a psychological bias where we can sort of understand and process and conceptualize change, but we conceptualize it as a paradigm shift. And what we're living through is not a paradigm shift. It's a cascade. It's a mudslide. That is how unstable the world that we're living on has become. And we can figure out ways to live in that world, but it means taking seriously not just what has changed already, but the pace of change to come, and making investments and, you know, taking measures to allow for human flourishing in that context, not just the context in which we live today, because today is, you know, already an outdated climate paradigm. And in fact, I think there's some indications, probably a conversation for another time, but some indications that warming's actually accelerating, not just continuing at the same pace. So we may see, in addition to all the surprises that we've seen, we may also see the baseline global average temperature rise more quickly in the years ahead. And I don't think hardly anyone is quite ready for that.
Well, your writing has been so influential to the way that I and so many others think about the climate crisis, not just the science, but what it means for people. We'll link to all of your recent columns in the New York Times in our show notes so that our audience can read them as well. David Wallace-Wells, thank you again for joining me today on the Climate Pod.
Great to be here. Thanks again for having me, and great to catch up. Hope we do it again soon.